This is video for Unit 1, video 4, for Math 8, estimating square roots. Now recall that a perfect square is a number that has integer square roots. And what I mean by that is, for example, square root of 25 has 5 and -5 as square roots. So it comes out to a whole number, or some nice integers, not decimals and fractions. Alright, the next thing I want you to do, and I know this looks like a lot, but you know this already, is to complete the table below by listing the first 15 perfect squares and their square roots. So I want you to pause the video and try this on your own before you look at the answers. Now, the way I like to do this is I go to the side and I do 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared 16, 5 squared is 25, 6 squared equals 36, 7 squared equals 49, 8 squared equals 64, 9 squared equals 81, 10 squared equals 100, 11 squared equals 121, 12 squared equals 144, 13 squared equals 169, 14 squared equals 196, 15 squared equals 225. So that's the way I like to do it. I can't really think of the perfect squares just off the top of my head. I have to write them out like that, but whatever works for you. So now I can fill in this table easily. So perfect squares, we have 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, 121, 144, 169, 196. I can't fit that one at the bottom, but 225. So now square root of 1 is 1. And we can fill in this table very easily. And you should have that last row, but I can't fit it on mine. And I'm not sure if you caught on, but I kind of made a mistake here. Now, if we're looking at the square roots column, think about what I left out. So the square root of 1 does not only have 1 square root, right? So I should have the negatives listed here as well. So all of these in this column should have the negatives. So make sure you have the positive and negative root. Do not forget the negative roots, because you will get only half credit on your test for listing 1 root. Alright, so you can approximate the value of non-perfect squares using what you know about perfect squares. Between which 2 perfect squares would you find the number 65? So the way we're going to do this is 65 is not a perfect square. So we're trying to figure out which 2 perfect squares 65 falls between. So the square root of 65 is not going to come out to be a nice integer for us. It's going to come out to be a decimal. But to make it easier on us, we're finding which 2 perfect squares 65 falls between. So I know 65 falls between the square root of 64 and the square root of 81. So we can write 64 and 81. And what are their square roots? So the square root of 64, we're just going to take the positive roots here. So 8 and the square root of 81 is 9. So knowing that, between which two integers would you find the square root of 65? So we know the square root of 65 is between the integers 8 and 9. So that helps us get a good approximation, knowing it's between those two perfect squares. So now we're going to practice a little. So without using your calculator, approximate the value of each of the following square roots by identifying the perfect squares the radicand falls between. So when we say radicand, we're just talking about the number that falls under the square root. So in that first example, we're talking about 12 as the radicand. So if you want, you can draw an arrow pointing to 12 being under the square root to help you remember that. So for this first one, we're trying to estimate the square root of 12. So the square root of 12 is between which two perfect squares? So thinking of my perfect squares, it falls between the square root of 9, 9 is a perfect square, and the square root of 16, 16 is also a perfect square. And if you remember, our perfect squares are the square roots that come out to be nice integers for us. So therefore, we know the square root of 12 is between the integers of 3 and 4. So that helps us determine which two integers the square root of 12 is between. Alright, for the next one, the square root of 75 is between which two perfect squares? So we can think of our perfect squares, and I believe it falls between the square root of 64 and 81. So therefore, we know the square root of 75 is between the integers of 8 and 9. Now for these next problems, you'll notice the negative sign before the square roots. So when we're trying to approximate the square roots of non-perfect squares, if there's no negative sign in front of the square root, we're going to look for the positive roots. We're approximating the positive square root. If there's a negative sign before it, that means we're going to approximate for the negative square root. So for this first one, we have the negative square root of 29, meaning we're looking for the negative root of the square root of 29. We're trying to approximate in the negative direction. So let's ignore the negative for a second. So thinking of the square root of 29, it falls between the square root of 25 and 36. But just to keep in mind that we're looking for the negative root, I'm going to put a negative sign in front of both of my square roots, my perfect squares. So therefore we know it is between the integers of -5 and -6. So the negative root of 29, the negative square root of 29, falls between the integers -5 and -6. So I think it's easier to approach these problems by keeping the negative in mind, but handling the problems like there is no negative, so you don't get too confused. Alright, so for the negative square root of 57, the square root of 57 is between the square root of 49 and the square root of 64. Keep my negatives in mind, and therefore it is between the integers of -7 and -8. So we're approximating these perfect squares. So when we're approximating the negative square root of 57, it is between the integers of -7 and -8. Alright, so for your video questions today, number 1, you're answering which statement is true about the square root of 37. So you're trying to approximate the square root of 37 and decide between those answer choices. And then for number 2, for your response, Trisha estimates that the square root of 85 is about 8. Do you agree or disagree? Explain. So for the explain part, I'm looking for about 1 or 2 sentences explaining why you agree or disagree with Trisha.